Backstory is one of the most misunderstood parts of writing a novel, and because of that, most writers end up swinging hard in one of two extremes. Either we give way too much backstory, dumping everything in all at once in all the wrong places in all the wrong way, and we end up just sort of stalling our story out, or we hear all those writing gurus cautioning us not to info dump, and we panic. We strip out almost all of the backstory, and suddenly the novel feels thin or confusing or emotionally flat because the reader doesn't actually have enough context to understand what anything means. But here's the thing. The problem isn't the backstory itself. The backstory absolutely belongs in the novel. It's non-negotiable. The real problem is that most writers were simply never taught how to use backstory well. So in this episode, we're going to dive into that. How to handle backstory in a way that deepens your novel instead of derailing it, and how to find that balance between too much and not enough. Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, founder of the World Shift Writing Summit, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world too. You probably already know your novel needs backstory. You know your characters didn't just spring into existence one day. You know their past matters. You know that readers need context in order to understand what's happening and why it matters. And yet, every time you try and put that backstory on the page, it just feels off. Clunky, awkward, like it doesn't belong where you've put it. Like the story suddenly stumbles instead of flowing forward. So you start second-guessing yourself. You move things around. You cut it. You put it back. You wonder if the problem is that you're including too much or not enough, or you're doing it wrong somehow. That tension, knowing backstory is necessary, but never quite feeling like you've placed it right, is what we're going to untangle in this episode. Because backstory isn't just extra information. It gives scenes weight. It makes character choices make sense. It's where emotion and meaning and motivation actually come from. When backstory is missing, scenes feel hollow or confusing, like something important is just out of reach. And when it's mishandled, we all know that it can stall the story out completely, pushing readers out instead of drawing them in. What most writers are missing isn't the understanding that they need backstory, though. Most of us really do understand that. What we're missing is a framework. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the 5 core guidelines of backstory. These are not rigid rules that you have to follow perfectly, but they're practical principles that you can use to decide what belongs on the page, what doesn't, and why. By the end of the episode, my goal is that backstory will feel less like a constant source of doubt and more like a tool that you know how to use with confidence. Okay, let's dive in. Guideline number 1. Backstory has to be relevant to the scene and to the story as a whole. Yes, I know that sounds obvious, but this is where many writers get tripped up. Your protagonist should feel like a real person, which means they have a past, they have memories, they have experiences that shaped them, they carry emotional baggage, beliefs, and scars. All of that is good, necessary. But here's the tricky part. Just because something is true about your character doesn't necessarily mean it belongs on the page. The backstory you include needs to be relevant to who your protagonist is as a person, the character arc they're moving through in the novel, the plot of the novel itself, and this is the part that matters most, the specific moment they are experiencing. Backstory shouldn't be included just because you know it or just because it's interesting in isolation. It should be included because it's doing something meaningful in this moment of the story. A simple gut check I like to use is this. Is this backstory explaining something important that the reader wouldn't be able to understand about this moment if I pulled it out? If the answer is yes, it probably belongs. If the answer is no, It might be great backstory, but it probably doesn't belong here, in this moment, in this scene. Because here's the thing, knowing a lot of backstory about your character and about the world that they exist in is incredibly useful for you as a writer. But that doesn't automatically make it useful to the reader in every scene. Relevance is about choosing what the reader needs to know right now and giving them only that. Guideline number 2. Look, guideline number 2 is the big one. This is the guideline that makes everything else work. Backstory should be framed as interiority. And I want to pause here for just a second because this guideline is doing so much heavy lifting. This episode pairs really closely with episode 41, where I did a deep dive into interiority as a craft tool on its own, what it is, why it matters, and how it works on the page. You don't need to have listened to that episode first for this one to make sense, but I do highly suggest going back to that episode and listening to it if you haven't already, and then maybe coming back and reviewing Guideline 2 after you've done that. Okay, back to the guideline itself. When backstory is framed as interiority, it doesn't sound like a dry explanation that came from an encyclopedia. Instead, it sounds like we're inside the point of view character's head. And honestly, this is truly 100% the difference between backstory given in a way that makes readers super curious and backstory that sounds like an info dump. You can get away with adding a whole heck of a lot of backstory, actually, if you add it as a form of interiority, meaning the character is simply explaining the backstory in the words and phrases and ways that they would think about giving that to someone. So it's like you're kind of sitting next to someone, listening to them tell you about the past, instead of having it dryly narrated by a distant narrator. So truly, what pushes readers away with large chunks of backstory isn't the backstory itself. It's that the backstory is dry and neutral and emotionally flat. It states facts without texture, without opinion, without voice. Let me give you some examples of the difference between sort of that dry narration encyclopedia type backstory and backstory that is given through interiority. Here's an example of a couple of lines of backstory that is dry narration. It's just the facts, ma'am. 6 months ago, I had sat nervously on the green couch and waited for the psychiatrist to see me. I hadn't wanted to be there because she always made me feel bad about myself. Okay, so we have some words in here that are supposed to indicate emotion. We have nervously and feel bad about myself, but still this just feels dry. It just feels there's nothing to it. I can't get a sense truly of who this protagonist is or how they felt about things. And I certainly am not internalizing those feelings myself. Now compare it to this. Here's an example of how one very specific type of character might say the same thing. 6 months ago, I'd sat on that ugly, vomit-colored couch and waited for the effing shrink to call me into her office so she could tell me, in excruciating detail, exactly how and why I was a screw-up, just like she always did. Okay, so I kind of imagine this character as kind of like a Danny DeVito person. I don't know if you're old enough to know who Danny DeVito is, but this is kind of, as I was writing this couple of sentences, I'm like, yeah, that's my Danny DeVito character. But try this version out. This is an entirely different character. 6 months ago, I slouched down deep into the plush folds of the olive green couch and pinned my eyes to the floor, wondering if Dr. Johnson would even notice me sitting there. Most days, she hardly seemed to register my presence, even when she was droning on and on about why every fight between me and my mom was, you guessed it, my fault. Okay, so this character is having different emotions and is expressing those just in word choices and phrases. So hopefully you can see that even though technically all three of these sentences are saying kind of the same thing, I'm making the voice of the last two examples I gave you distinct, and their opinions are in there, and the voice of the character is in there, and their interiority is sort of all over everything. I don't even need to include words like nervously or felt bad about myself because I've included those ideas in just the way I wrote the sentences. That, my friend, is interiority. That is the difference between dry narration, info dump, and backstory passages that make readers sort of giddy to keep reading. Honestly, backstory is one of my favorite parts of any novel. I know that sounds weird, but I get this giddy, bubbly feeling every time we dive into backstory, so long as the writer gives it to me through the lens of interiority, because I feel like I'm sitting down with that character over coffee and they're confiding everything in me. And I find that just tantalizing. So here's the key thing that I want you to take away from this. Backstory is never neutral, or it shouldn't be if you're doing it right. There's no objective version of the past, only the version filtered through the character's memories, emotions, and worldview. Two people can live through the same event and remember it completely differently. That's not a problem. That's the point of it, right? We want to know how your protagonist feels about the past or about the history of the world that they're in. So when you're writing backstory, you're not just relaying what happened. You're showing what the character thinks about what happened, what they believe it meant, and how that meaning is shaping the present moment. Guideline number 3, backstory needs to be clear and specific and concrete. Vagueness doesn't create intrigue. It creates confusion and distance. A simple way to check whether your backstory is working is to ask yourself one question. Can I visualize this? If the answer is no, your reader can't either, and it just doesn't feel compelling. Let me give you a couple of examples where I either have vague, non-specific language that I can't visualize versus language that is concrete, clear, and specific that I can visualize. All right, here's the one that's vague. Rachel hadn't seen Nico in years, not since the night he broke her trust. Okay. So as a reader, I can't visualize this. Years feels fuzzy. Like, how many years? Has it been 30 years or has it been 2 years? Also, the phrase broke her trust is abstract. I have no image there, nothing concrete to grab onto. I don't know what this means. It just feels vague and a little bit confusing and honestly, a little bit annoying. Now compare it to this. Rachel hadn't seen Nico in over 9 years, not since the night she'd walked in on him taking tequila shots with James in that old apartment they shared in the city. James, who was supposed to be their friend. James, who was supposed to care about Nico's sobriety as much as she did. Okay, now I can see it. Now I can picture the apartment. Now I know what broken trust means to her. It means that he was supposed to be sober and she caught him drinking. I understand what the betrayal is here. And even though I don't know the whole story yet, I am not at all confused, but I am curious to know more. That's the difference specificity makes. Those details, they matter to readers. They pull us in. They give us the visual. They make us feel connected to the character and the story. All right, here's another example. This sentence is sort of vague and confusing. The soldiers had roamed the streets, terrorizing and abusing the townspeople. Again, I can't visualize this. Terrorizing and abusing are concepts. They are not images. I don't know what it actually looked like on the ground. What were the soldiers doing? Where was any of this taking place? So now let's listen to this version. The soldiers had spent the better part of the summer roaming the streets of Thornhaven with their swords drawn. They kicked in merchants' doors, overturned market tables, and swung their steel at any passerby stupid enough to try to stop them. By the time the leaves began to change, broken crockery and spilled grain lined the streets, and the townspeople had learned to keep their eyes on the ground and their children hidden. Now I can picture this. Now I know what terrorizing and abusing means. I can see the streets. I can feel the fear. It feels real and textured. And I've learned something important about the tone of this story. Meaning, this is probably not a Game of Thrones kind of story, right? Because they weren't gutting the people. They weren't putting their heads on pikes. They were knocking stuff over and swinging their swords at them, which might mean that this is kind of a cozy fantasy novel. I don't know, but it certainly does set the tone, and it does tell me what terrorizing and abusing means. And notice how both of my examples were very clear, they were specific, and they gave me concrete details that the reader can visualize. It doesn't only explain, it gives the reader enough detail to form the mental picture, understand the emotional stakes, and stay grounded in the world without dumping the entire history on them all at once. When your backstory is concrete and visual, readers trust you. They feel oriented, and that makes them willing to follow you wherever the story goes next. Guideline number 4, backstory needs to be placed well. You can't just stop the story to explain something because the reader needs to know it. That's when backstory starts to feel really intrusive and like an info dump. Backstory works best when it grows naturally out of what's happening in the present moment. This also relates back to guideline number 1 about it being relevant, right? It must be relevant to the moment, and it must be relevant to the beat within the scene, meaning again, you can't just stuff it in there because the reader needs to know it. Here's how you should be handling backstory. Something happens externally in the scene. That triggers a memory, a thought, a reflection. And then we're in the protagonist or point of view character's head. They're giving us that backstory. They're telling us what it means. They're comparing the present moment in the scene to some past memory or context that they have. And then something important has to happen. When we, as the reader, come back to the present moment with that point of view character, we understand something more about the story than we did before. And it's not like we just understand something random. We understand something more about the present moment, that specific moment. And the scene would have been locked to us had we not gone into this memory, this context. So backstory shouldn't feel like a detour or a tangent. It should feel like a spotlight, briefly illuminating something that helps us unlock the present moment in the story. Okay, the final guideline number 5. Backstory needs to be added in the right dosage. Even beautifully written backstory can become too much if it's delivered all at once. For most writers, especially while you're building confidence with interiority, backstory works best in small amounts, spread throughout the story. I always think of it like seasoning. Look, I love pepper. I put pepper on literally everything, even my spaghetti. But I don't unscrew the top of the pepper grinder and dump out the peppercorns right in my plate. That would be overwhelming. And backstory works the same way. Small amounts spaced out, doing their job without overwhelming the scene. So very often when we're adding backstory, we might be adding 1 to 3 or 4 lines in between dialogue, during an action sequence, something like that. So we're not just dumping like paragraphs and paragraphs of information. It's just a line or 2 or 3, just enough that's added in there that readers will be illuminated. They will begin to understand better the present moment, but they won't be completely derailed into the past. One note though, early in a novel, backstory will naturally be added in bigger doses because the reader needs a lot of orientation when they're first getting into a world. Again, if it's framed through interiority, if it's relevant, if it's clear, concrete, and specific, it's okay. It's not going to be an info dump. What I'd say is that you really need to just go look at other books in your genre. Books that are current, meaning they've been published in the last 3 to 5 years. Probably books that are by debut authors because it means the quality of the work and the way the backstory is being added, as well as everything else, is working in today's market. It's not just selling because they have a big name. So go look at those books and see how and where the backstory is added in the first 3 to 5 chapters. Okay, my friends, that's it for today. We have briefly gone over the 5 guidelines of backstory, and I hope this was really helpful to you. And if you haven't done so already, please click the link in the show notes and get on my email list. If you're on my email list, you'll hear all about my upcoming free and paid classes. Plus, you'll be able to sign up for any free writing sprints that I do. So honestly, being on my email list is a great place to be, and I know you're going to love the stuff that I give you. So go ahead down there and get on my email list so you can get all the fun goodies that I want to share with you. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, The world needs your stories right now, so don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk soon.